We're ready? Okay, thank you. Welcome, 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 welcome. Let me acknowledge straight away that my brief opening remarks are indebted to a report released just last week by the Vera Institute of Justice titled Reimagining Prison. I highly recommend the roughly 100-page report. And I was especially glad to see it because we conceived of this panel during the announcement of the prison strike of last August, in that it wasn't anywhere in the news. When I'll mention the series we do here called Currents in Conversation, but it became a reason to have a current in conversation because it wasn't a current in conversation, though we thought it should be. But let me proceed. In 1971, people incarcerated at the Attica Correctional Facility in New York took over the prison for 2 weeks, protesting what one participant, Elliot Barkley, described as the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners. He went on to say, "We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten and driven as such." In 2013, some 30,000 people in various California correctional facilities engaged in a hunger strike, some refusing food for close to 2 months in protest of the state's use of long-term solitary confinement. In September 2016, the largest nationwide prison strike took place, covering 24 states and including up to 24,000 participants, during which incarcerated people staged work stoppages or hunger strikes to object to unfair use of prison labor, poor wages, abusive guards, overcrowding, and poor health care, among other grievances. Commenting on his $2 a day pay, an amount only sufficient to buy a bar of soap at the commissary or perhaps make a short phone call, one participant, David Bonner, declared emphatically, "This is slavery. We're forced to work these jobs and we get barely nothing." And in April 2018, the dismal reality of life in prison, 2 meals of barely nutritional, sometimes moldy food, putrid water, metal plates placed over windows, sweltering and filthy rooms, and no hope idleness simmered into explosive acts of violence at a prison in South Carolina that left 7 dead and 17 injured. All incarcerated people, guards, had evacuated the unit. And in August 2018, incarcerated people began a 21-day labor strike in response to the tragic incident in South Carolina to protest U.S. prison conditions, including mandated labor for meager wages. How many of you know that there was a national prison strike in this country this past August? All right, a few people, but the majority of you did not know, didn't hear that there was a prison strike going on. Okay, all right, that's the strike, which involved prisoners in 17 states, marked the anniversary of the bloody uprising at the Attica Correctional Facility in New York that I just mentioned. When I've mentioned this past strike, this August strike, to people in passing, most are not aware that this strike was going on. This lack of awareness was, for me, cause to host our first Currents in Conversation forum for this academic year. This series is the anchor of the Woodson Institute's 10-year-old public outreach arm, which has sponsored a variety of fora, film screenings, town hall discussions designed to engage and enlighten local community leaders, elected officials, influential allies, students, faculty, and ordinary citizens around race, social justice, and structural inequalities. These public events serve as the Institute's so-called rapid response initiative, bringing together our faculty, students, and invited guests to discuss urgent topics in current conversation, which dominate the headlines, the airwaves, and social media, hence Currents. Past roundtables have included race, wealth, and college admissions, race and electoral politics, race and the politics of the debt ceiling, race and predatory lending, and most recently on S blank blank whole countries, race, racism, and immigration. And so note today we turn to the prison strike, or certainly the carceral state, which should remain a current in this nation's conversation, as well as a current in our university's conversations. Such conversations are needed especially within the context of our focus on the violent roots of white supremacy and their physical manifestations in the Confederate statuary being toppled all over the country. The attention we have afforded these monuments to white supremacy is almost equal to the attention we have afforded our institutional roots in slavery. Perhaps it is long overdue that we turn to deepening our study of our institutional roots in slavery by turning our attention to the carceral state, to what the prison abolitionist Angela Davis terms the prison of slavery, which became the slavery of prison. Currently an over $2 billion a year industry where the average daily wage is 93 cents. Roughly 80% of these meager wages can be withheld for reasons such as room and board. 4 states, Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, and Texas, pay no wages at all. Prisoners during the most recent as well as earlier prison strikes point to the history of U.S. prison labor as indeed analogous to slavery. So James, my little thingy won't work. So how do I show the audience the Jefferson drawings? I will be very brief so we can hear our... Oh, I'm sorry, live audience on Facebook and YouTube. That's all right, we're very loose here. How many of you, especially students at the University of Virginia, know that the founder of your university was present at the birth of the prison? 1, 2, all right. We're not gonna belabor things here. I'm gonna leave this to the anchor of the panel. But these are Jefferson's prison drawings. He did these drawings when he was in Paris, and they were never executed, but they were to have been, or had they been, this would have been the first ever penitentiary in Virginia. Although these particular drawings were never executed, look at Jefferson's handwriting, look at the model of segregation there in the prison. These drawings were never executed. They're currently in the Massachusetts Historical Society. Jefferson was, in fact, in close contact, in close interaction with the leading prison architects of the day, all right? So, almost 150 years ago, just 5 years after the end of the Civil War, the Supreme Court of Virginia articulated a vision for prison that was a direct descendant of slavery. In 1871, the court said that the incarcerated person, and I quote, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights, except those which the law in its humanity accords to him, and that for the period of time in custody, he is to be the slave of the state. This vision of prison was not accidental and would hold sway for generations. It manifested itself in such practices as convict leasing, a brutal and financially lucrative system in the Reconstruction South that created incentives for governments to arrest and convict newly freed Black people in order to sell their labor to private industry, and chain gangs in which incarcerated people were shackled together, publicly humiliated, and forced to perform public works such as building roads or clearing land. Beyond the walls of prison, incarceration's impact is broad. Mass imprisonment disrupts social networks, distorts social norms, and hollows out citizenship. The high rate of incarceration, most notably among Black Americans, as well as the individual impact of incarceration, has decimated the communities from which people in prison come. Its impact is also intergenerational. The children of incarcerated parents are more likely to experience psychological trauma, difficulties in school, and financial challenges. The cumulative result of this system is a pervasive and pernicious denigration of the humanity of those who live and work inside American prisons that ripples out to communities and across generations. Over this country's long history of using prisons, American values of supposed fairness and justice have been sacrificed to these institutions in the name of securing the common good of public safety. But the harsh conditions within prisons have been demonstrated neither to ensure safety behind the walls nor to prevent crime and victimization in the community. This country's long history of using prisons for a variety of purposes not coextensive with justice has become harsher and more onerous in direct response to decades of tough on crime political sentiments. Now that this country is supposedly in the midst of a genuine sociocultural movement of heightened consciousness about racial and social injustice in this community, we claim, triggered by appalling manifestations and validations of racism, even from the highest precincts of government, but strengthened by the growing number of people who are willing to acknowledge the country's history of racial oppression and support actions to rectify it. It is time to acknowledge that this country has long used state punishment generally, and incarceration specifically, to subordinate racial and ethnic minorities. And so, to take a truly decisive step away from the past, America needs a new set of normative values on which to ground prison policy and practice, values that simultaneously recognize, interrogate, and unravel the heretofore persistent connections between racism and this country's system of punishment. This latter language is the language of the Vera Institute's report. But I would ask the authors, in what would a new set of normative values consist? And how would such values ground prison policy and practice for a total laboring population of, what's the recent number? Yes.
Just under 2.3 million.
That's what all right. I didn't want to mislead, absolutely. So this is how many people we are engaging. What choices would we have to make when we consider that every single field and industry is affected on some level by prisons, from our license plates to the fast food that we eat to the stores where we shop, and I would add, to the furniture in the very classrooms of our university. Anybody who wants to buy any furniture from the university has to submit 3 bids. 2 out of those 3 bids will come from outfits that use prison labor, all right? We are literally feeding the prison industrial complex with our dollars. This afternoon, we have with us 4 people to participate in this latest Currents in Conversation Forum, which is anchored by my dear and esteemed colleague, Dennis Childs, author of the justly acclaimed book, Slaves of the State, Black Incarceration from the Chain Gang to the Penitentiary. Further information about Professor Childs, as well as our other esteemed guests, A.D. Carson, Shannon Ellis, and Jory Yeager, is in the program. At the Woodson Institute, we have the perverse practice of printing brief bios in the program so that we can reserve the maximum amount of time for a discussion. So bios are there. Please join me in welcoming my colleagues, beginning with Dennis.
Thank you, Dr. McDowell, and I want to take the opportunity to thank you personally for the invitation to come here for a second time now. And I also want to thank the fellows in the Carter G. Woodson Institute for an incredible day, an incredible dialogue earlier, and particularly Dion Bailey for an incredible paper that we talked about. I also want to give my special thanks to Shelley Thomas and Debbie Best for their the excellent expert manner in which they handled my complicated travel from the West Coast. I came out from one of the prison capitals of the world to join you today, that being California, that bastion of liberal democracy, the Golden State, that is also, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore correctly charges, the Golden Gulag, one of the leaders in incarcerating human beings on the planet. In fact, at its peak, if California were a country, it would have been ranked number 5 in the world in incarceration on its own, without being added to the other 49 states in the colonial slaveocracy that we live in. The last time I was here, it was a rough time. It was the time soon after the mass killing at the Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina. And then now, it's another rough time. It's not very far. We're still in the wake, as Christina Sharp would say, of the violence, the white supremacist incidents here in Charlottesville. But in thinking of that and thinking of those two incidents framing my visits here to UVA, I had to come to terms with what Dr. McDowell and I were talking about earlier, which is there's not a day on the calendar without such incidents in the history of the US empire. Such incidents on a spectacular level, but also on a more grinding, banal level that have affected indigenous people in particular, and also Africans and people of African descent. And now we could add, of course, those people of color and migrant bodies that are being shoveled into what the prisoners that led the most recent prison strike rightfully call a system, in my estimation, of prison slavery. And this makes me think of Jamaica Kincaid's really important intervention in a small place where she describes history in a certain really eloquent manner, but also one that is very visceral. History being an open wound that reopens with every breath. History as an open wound that reopens with every breath. And what does that intervention allow for? Well, it allows for the ability to demystify the characterization of history in the US, which wants us to read history as something dead, as a fossil, to be talked about in objectifying terms, to be embalmed in the past. But if indeed history is a wound that reopens with every breath, or what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlives of the past coming to haunt us every day, then it's not just these spectacular incidents of violence that we need to attend to. It's the more everyday, again, grinding pattern of white supremacy, patriarchy, misogyny, imperialism, and capitalism that in their intersectionality affect both people domestically and globally. And the prison, I think, is a central place to begin that discussion. And I think it's interesting that one of the founders here, Thomas Jefferson, you know, he has those prison drawings that we just took a brief look at, but Thomas Jefferson knew very well what he was talking about when he talked about the incarceration of black women and men that appeared in that drawing. Because he was, in effect, a warden himself, a slave master of Monticello Plantation, but Monticello Plantation was also a prison. If you look at the statistics of black incarceration on a plot line, there's a real dramatic increase right after 1865 in the United States. Why is that? Because black people were already imprisoned. 4 million prisoners by 1865 on what are called slave plantations. Or if you go to some current museums in the South, I guess they call them farms or something like that. They try to euphemize what happened there. If they mention slavery at all, it won't be in the title of a place like Monticello. Well, the prisoners that led the most recent prison strike, and I'm glad Dr. McDowell also mentioned one from 2013 in my state of California, the largest prisoner hunger strike in history, at least in the history of the United States. 30,000 or close to 30,000 prisoners refusing to eat, risking their lives. Why? And Dr. McDowell asked how many people have heard of the most recent strike. How many of you heard of the hunger strike of prisoners in 2013? Look around the room. So here we are in the contemporary moment of replete information. You're all walking computer data networks. But in this context of the most information in the history of information, most of us know nothing, or especially those of us who don't have family members who are encaged. And we're talking about, just as a brief plot line, As of 2009, 1 out of 100 adults in the United States being incarcerated, a country that describes itself internationally as the leader in democracy and freedom. 1 out of 100 adults. An 800% increase in the incarceration of women between 1980 and 2000 during that same period. You had, right as of 2009, 1 out of 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 30 in a cage. And at that same time period, a quarter of black men in that same age category either in prison or under some form of state control, probation, or parole. And when I talked about that 800% increase in the imprisonment of women, we got to get out of the statistical ball game and into the reality that that represents. Again, focusing on California, there's a facility there called CIW Corona, where it has the dubious distinction of being currently one of the leaders in prisoner suicide in the country. In one calendar year, a woman named Shailene Graves, a black woman, was found hanging in her cell. In that same year, Erica Roca, a Latina, was found hanging in her cell. Erica Roca, who was put in the institution when she was under the age of 15, I believe, because of the Proposition 21 legislation in California that allowed for putting people as young as 14 years old in adult prisons. And that Proposition 21 was not an outlier. The prison strikers, and I hope everyone will take a look at the hashtag August 21 prison strike on Twitter and look at the information about this strike. And one of the things that they do is demystify the notion that we're dealing with the only boogeyman in US presidential history right now. The boogeyman right now is representative of a larger structure of racial capitalist misogynist terror, in my estimation, and in the estimation of those who've lived the most visceral and grinding and what could be called the 0 degree of that experience of terrorism, of state terrorism. In fact, Dr. McDowell mentioned the riot that occurred at the Lee Correctional Facility in South Carolina, appropriately named after a certain Confederate general. The riot, what the prisoners did, as in the case of Attica, and I think Shannon will be talking about that in a little bit. I think that was your slide. No, Dr. McDowell's only? Okay, well, I'll say more about that then. What they did, a la the rebellion in Attica, was to reframe the narrative around their own incarceration and around the particularities of that riot, and said, the condition of possibility for the so-called tragedy that just happened here was our dehumanization in this facility, being treated, as the Attica Rebellion talked about, as beasts instead of as human beings. And this is a refrain that you see throughout the history of such events, such uprisings within the prison systems and jail systems of the United States. This call to, again, the Jamaica Kincaid notion that nothing has ended in terms of the ruptures that brought us here through a system of legalized kidnapping on a scale untold in human history. Again, the prevailing current of the liberal racial capitalist state would like for us to put that story of that mass kidnapping onto the original prisons of the US prison industrial complex, i.e. the barracoons and slave ships and slave pens of the Middle Passage and plantation slavery into the proverbial dustbin of history. But the prisoners who led this strike said, wait a minute, if you want to talk about disorder and criminality, the state is the criminal entity at the very core of culpability that caused this. How so? Bill Clinton in 1994 passes the crime bill. He also passes in 1996 truth and sentencing reforms to the prison system. Why? To make people do things that were untold in South Carolina's recent history, like do natural life in prison, which means you go, you never get out. Taking away Pell Grants and education programs. This is all under Bill Clinton. One of the boogeymen of the prison industrial complex, I recommend everybody read Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis for a really straightforward history of what's called the prison industrial complex, is that Ronald Reagan is culpable. Yes, that B-movie actor is indeed culpable for the prison industrial complex. And that is the way in which industrial interests combine with political interests to make the incarceration of human beings a driving force of state practice in the United States, rather than maybe offering it public education or healthcare, or maybe something that would really end what is called individual crime, a job that pays a living wage. In fact, that is one of the things in terms of the intellectual history of prison uprisings that this last instance of the prison strike really informs us, is that what is really at the core here is a political economic problem, which is to say, after black slave labor no longer became the very engine of the US industrializing nation state, what do you do with the people that you don't want to let into, say, UVA or UCSD or into the technological fields? What do you do with the people that were doing that last hired, first fired work? What do you do? This is the language that members of governments have used. What do we do with them after that project? And so flipping the script on the narrative of criminality to highlight the criminality of the very state enterprise of criminalization that landed them there in the first place, and that keeps landing them back there even if they have the chance to get out. So in California, again, it's not just a matter of labor. Yes, we have to focalize that. But just as chattel slavery was not just about labor that produced cash crops, so too the new slavery or neo-slavery, or what the prisoners rightly call prison slavery, is not just about productive labor. Sitting in a cell as a person victimized by human warehousing, what do people like at the CIW prison that I mentioned earlier experience, black and brown and poor women? Well, from 2006 to 2010, there were over 100 cases of forced sterilization documented there, 100 cases and more. And that's only the forced sterilization that is documented. There's also the cases of voluntary sterilization programs that are throughout US jails and prisons for women. Shackled childbirth being legal in California until relatively recently. Shackling women for prenatal care visits. And what that really symbolizes is the fact that, as Orlando Patterson talks about in Slavery and Social Death, natal alienation, the separation of families, is the fundament of world historical slavery, not just what happened to black people. Separate families and thereby destroy community networks and thereby make somebody susceptible to being brutalized and dehumanized. By 2009, again, one prisoner was dying every 6 days from death by suicide or a treatable illness in the state of California. The biggest healthcare provider in the state of California, by the way, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Yes, bigger than Kaiser. So with that context that Dr. McDowell gave us, from the Attica Rebellion in 1971 to the prison strike of 2016 to the most recent one, we could also add something from 1977 by a group of prisoners in the prison called Stateville, Illinois, who were members of what was called the New African Prison Organization, or NAPO. And what they did in that year was submit a petition to the United Nations following the example of a petition that came out some almost 30 years earlier by members of the Civil Rights Congress called We Charge Genocide. The prisoners in that instance rewrote that and said, we still charge genocide. What was that still, that reopening of that wound that they were talking about based on? The same thing that the prison strikers say, which is to say, genocide is not just about the production of biological death at a mass scale, it's also about the production of mass living death. That we are being put into a place of cold storage, whereby life, to quote the Ruffin versus Commonwealth that Dr. McDowell said, the prisoner is to be treated as a slave of the state, and everything that he owns, or she, is to be treated like that of a dead man. This is the language of the state, not a raving professor in the front of the room, even though I've been charged with that, and gladly take that mantle. So, in the time that I have left, a couple of minutes.
That's good, that's good.
I did want to stress the way in which my orientation toward this conversation about the transition that was spoken of earlier, mentioned by Angela Davis, from the prison of slavery. Again, Monticello was a slave plantation and a prison. From the prison of slavery to the slavery of prison, one of the things I want to focus on is the way in which that intellectual enterprise of chronicling that transition and opening up the field of carceral studies to demystify what is called corrections, to show that it is in actual fact a project of social control based on white supremacy, misogyny, and capitalism in intersection. That charge intellectually, as Joy James, Dylan Rodriguez, Angela Davis, and others have said, that intellectual tradition has been led by prisoners themselves. That's really important to say at a space like this, at UVA or at the University of California. Joy James describes people like George Jackson, people like Angela Davis, people like Assata Shakur, people like Rochelle McGee, people like the anonymous prisoners that Dion is talking about in her project as imprisoned intellectuals. Many of you may have known Antonio Gramsci's Prison Notebooks. We have no problem identifying that as a masterwork of imprisoned intellectualism. But why is it that the intellectual labor of those like Assata Shakur often misses syllabi in places like this? I think it's because of the threat that it represents. I think that this knowledge that is being produced experientially produced knowledge, that is not to say that that's the only kind of knowledge that has value, but to say that it does have value. To speak of prison slavery from the place of prison slavery should be something that is afforded a lot of attention, even though, as Dr. McDowell said, it somehow is not a current of conversation as much as it should be on social media or any other kind of media. So let's look at the language of the petition in the time I have left. And note the refrain, okay? And please do look at these other instances that we talked about earlier in terms of Attica and the refrain, like a blues pickup over and over, the changing same, as Dr. McDowell talks about in her work. 7 comrades lost their lives during a senseless uprising that could have been avoided had the prison not been so overcrowded from the greed wrought by mass incarceration. This is from the petition itself. And a lack of respect for human life that is embedded in our nation's penology. These men and women are demanding humane living conditions, access to rehabilitation, sentencing reform, and the end of modern day slavery. The first utterances of this that I was aware of came in prison blues, going back all the way to the late 19th century and early 20th century. People like Huddie Ledbetter, or better known as Leadbelly. People like Robert Pete Williams, people like Odeya Matthews, who was entrapped at the place called Angola in Louisiana that many of you may know about. A modern slave plantation that is 18,000 acres, that's bigger than the island of Manhattan, that has never closed for a single day ever since its opening in the 19th century. Right now, today, people are doing labor that their ancestors were doing in the 19th century, serving their time from places like the Ninth Ward of New Orleans. So again, modern day slavery, where did this come from? It didn't come from the halls of academe, this intervention. It came from those who have been terrorized by this process. The demands: immediate improvements to the conditions of prisons and policies that recognize the humanity of imprisoned men and women. An immediate end to prison slavery, allowing imprisoned humans a proper channel to address grievances and violations of rights. Number 4, no human shall be sentenced to death by incarceration. Sentenced to death by incarceration, that's an interesting phrasing. What does that mean? Or serve any sentence without the possibility of parole. Number 5, an immediate end to the racial overcharging, oversentencing, and parole denials of black and brown humans. Black humans shall no longer be denied parole because the victim of the crime was white. Number 6, an immediate end to racist gang enhancement laws targeting black and brown humans. Number 7, no imprisoned human shall be denied access to rehabilitation programs. What's the refrain? Anyone? The word that is repeated over and over.
Oh, slavery.
Slavery and human. This is the ontological, what Sylvia Wynter calls the work of ontological, having to do with being. In Notes in the State of Virginia, you know this, right? The founder here described black people as akin to orangutans and said that he was not sure if black people were actually a part of the same species. This is real. This notion of subhumanity is not real in reality, but real in the way in which it's a productive myth that allows for the social acceptance of something like the prison industrial complex. So the prisoners know that full well more than I hopefully ever will, which is you are a human being, but you still can be dehumanized. Sylvia Wynter describes it like this in terms of the N word, but we got to think about how maybe the N word transitioned to the C word, that is criminal. The ultimate 0-degree category of ostensibly primal human nature whose differentiation from a lurking bestiality was dangerously imprecise and uncertain, so uncertain as to call for a question mark to be placed with respect to the humanity of this 0-degree category. The question mark, though, was a productive one. If you can question one's humanity, then you can freely dehumanize one. And I'll just end by saying this. What is to be done? Mumia Abu-Jamal, Leonard Peltier, Rochelle McGee, Russell Maroon Schultz, Mutulu Shakur, Janine Africa, and the rest of the Move 9, California families to abolish solitary confinement, CFASC, California families to abolish solitary confinement, all of us or none, critical resistance, students against mass incarceration. Often in these things, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? Well, you organize. I had a student come up to me years ago and say, what do I do about this? I said, well, join an organization. She said there was none. I said, well, start one. She did, and now it's 7 years running, Students Against Mass Incarceration at UCSD. They passed a prison divestment bill on my campus. So you cannot, after hearing this, as the hunger strikers said in California, after reading Assata Shakur's autobiography, how many of you have read it? Okay, you have no excuse not to if you're interested in these issues. You cannot unhear it. Then you have to actually take responsibility. So I would just say, I'm open to more dialogue with you if you want to enter into the fray in whatever small way that we can work as the abolitionists of today. Thank you.
All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Deborah asked me to come not because I have particular expertise or in-depth knowledge about the prison strike that occurred this year, but because my current work is as an advocate for incarcerated people. And I hoped that I might be able to share with you sort of a bit of an on-the-ground picture about conditions at a prison that is actually only about 20 miles away from here. So one thing that we've talked about tonight already quite a bit is the lack of current conversation, the lack of knowledge about prison conditions and problems within prison. And so I'm curious, we're all here at the University of Virginia tonight. How many of you know that Virginia's largest women's prison is only 20 miles away? So that prison is the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women, and it houses 1,200 women. It's a max security prison, but all of the women who are at the prison are not max security inmates. They are brought there often because that is the prison that Virginia sends its sickest female inmates to. It's supposed to be the medical prison. And so if you are ill and you're a woman in prison in Virginia, it doesn't matter if you're in on a nonviolent drug offense serving 2 years, you're going to go to this max security prison because that is where the doctors are and theoretically where you're going to get care, although we're going to talk about that. So over the past 2 years, I have spent hundreds of hours out at Fluvanna. I've met with well over 100 women talking about failures in their health care, but also those conversations have inevitably spilled over into the other issues that they face as institutionalized human beings. And those are all of the sorts of things you would think about and more. What do you do in prison when you are very ill and perhaps dying and you need to write a will? What do you do when you've been sexually assaulted by a guard? What do you do when you are able to be released on parole, but you're sick and you need to go to a nursing home and there's no one that will take you? What do you do when you're dying in prison and you have maybe a week left and the prison will not let your family visit with you for more than an hour a day? So these conversations have given me a very close-up personal window into some of the injustices that these women face on a day-to-day basis. And in the interest of giving you an idea of how this is happening in our backyard here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Fluvanna prison, starting sort of from a big picture of the issues that are affecting this particular prison and then focusing on some of the specific women at the prison. So to start, if I could go to the second, thank you. So in the United States, prisoners are protected by the 8th Amendment to the Constitution, and it prohibits the infliction of cruel and unusual punishment. And I use protected there. We say that they're protected by the 8th Amendment. And the Supreme Court has interpreted the 8th Amendment to forbid prisons from depriving inmates of basic human needs, such as shelter, food, exercise, clothing, sanitation, hygiene, and medical care. Now, as we have also talked about, and as I'm sure you're all aware, the United States has seen a huge spike in recent decades in the number of people that we're incarcerating, and we lead the world in our incarceration rates. So the problem, there are many problems, but the problem if you're a State Department of Corrections is that locking up all of these people costs money. It's very expensive. And one of the biggest expenses that prisons have to pay for, and it's growing larger every day as our prison population ages, and all these people who are not going to get out on parole, thanks to things like truth in sentencing laws, who are spending out the rest of their lives in prison, are requiring more and more medical care, is providing health care to these 2.3 million people. So what do states do to address this ballooning cost? We might all suggest that we examine our criminal justice policies and consider whether locking up this number of people or whether locking people up at all is actually a good idea. But states aren't doing that. Instead, what they're doing is turning to private for-profit health contractors to provide care. These private contractors bid to get the state contracts, and they have an incentive to bid as low as possible in order to be selected by the state. Many of these contracts operate on what's called a capitated model, and what that means is the private contractor is paid a flat dollar amount per head for the number of prisoners at the facility. And that's what they get, regardless of how much care the prisoners actually end up needing. And so it's very much in the private for-profit contractor's interest to provide as little care as possible to maximize their profits. That's the kind of contract that is in place 20 miles away at Fluvanna, where the sickest women in the state are sent. The women with cancer, the women with serious infections, women with dementia. This is where they go. So this is where you start to see the financial cost to the state translating into human cost to prisoners and even to their lives. And we heard the very evocative phrase, death by incarceration. And I am very sad to say that in just the 2 years that I have been working on the Fluvanna case, 15 of our clients have met their end through death by incarceration. These are women who would be getting out, but they died of their medical needs while they were at Fluvanna. So what does this human cost look like on the ground? It looks like the women out at Fluvanna. It looks like a young woman with a lifelong blood clotting disorder whose medication was not provided to her repeatedly by the prison, who wound up in the hospital here at UVA with internal bleeding, wondering if she was going to live through the last weeks of her sentence to go home to her toddler. It looks like a woman who is still out at Fluvanna right now with advanced multiple sclerosis, who, because it's hard to get her out of her bed and the prison is understaffed, is just left alone in a cell in conditions that are, it's effectively solitary confinement, despite the fact that her crime does not warrant that, if any crime does. Despite the fact that she's not been sentenced to that she's paraplegic, I mean, she can't move. She's no kind of discipline risk, but because of her medical needs and because of the prison's decision in how to fund that and how to staff it, she is effectively serving years and years of solitary confinement where she leaves her room very rarely. I have visited her and asked her when the last time she was out of her room was, and her answer is, it was the last time you came to see me 2 months ago. It looks like Deanna Neese, and if we can actually, I I'm sorry, move forward one more, I skipped that. I'm sorry, one more, I must have them out of order. Deanna Nice. That's Deanna. Deanna was a 38-year-old woman. She died last summer, 3 weeks before she would have been released home to her son, her young son. You can see there, Noah. On the day of her death, Ms. Nice repeatedly told prison employees that she was having trouble breathing, that she was having trouble walking. The prison, despite being this medical prison, does not employ many doctors or many nurses. Instead, they employ a bunch of certified nursing assistants and licensed practical nurses, which are not licensures that give you any kind of knowledge to make clinical decisions. And the LPN, the licensed practical nurse in her building, who she reported this to over and over again, told her, drink water, lay down, you'll be fine. And she died that night on the floor of her cell. We can go to the next. So the human cost looks like all of the 1,200 women and the 2.3 million people around the country who are living in facilities like this. And I think from this picture you can really see, when we're talking about warehousing, what a warehouse this is. It is sterile, it is box-like, it is everything that is not human or humane. So Dennis talked a little bit about what can we do to try to change the situation, and talked about organizing and the huge importance of organizing. One possible way to try to help prisoners is through the legal system, and that's what my organization in part does. We've tried to go through the courts in order to help the women at Fluvanna get the medical care that we believe the 8th Amendment entitles them to. A major barrier that you face, though, in this area is the Prison Litigation Reform Act, and this was passed in the 90s. So the stated purpose of the act, what Congress flat out said the point of the act was, is to decrease the amount of prisoner litigation. We want to get them out of the courts, too many in the courts. Nobody really stopped to think about, well, yeah, there's been a huge increase in prisoner litigation because, in the 70s and 80s, we started locking up a lot more people. So you would expect to see more prisoner lawsuits in the court. But instead of going back to that as the root problem, Congress just decided to make it much, much harder for prisoners to access the courts, which is one of the few ways that they can be heard outside the walls of their prison. And that was the one for the PLRA that if we can go back to, sorry. I apologize for not getting these in the right order. One more, just two more. Yes. So you can see here the effect of the Prison Litigation Reform Act on prisoners' access to the courts. What the PLRA says is that in order for a prisoner to get into court and be heard by a judge or be heard by a jury, they first have to exhaust the prison's own administrative grievance system. And each prison gets to set up its own grievance system. They can do it however they want. They can set the rules. They can have you fill out as many forms as you want with as many deadlines as you want. They could require you to sing Yankee Doodle while you do it. You have to follow their rules and exhaust their grievance system before you can even get into court. At Fluvanna, the grievance process is a complicated multi-step system that requires a woman to clearly explain her problem, and only one problem per form, only one, got to do different forms for all your different problems, and follow very strict and varying deadlines for submission of subsequent forms. This is completely inaccessible to many women at Fluvanna who struggle with literacy, who may not have completed more than an 8th grade education, who suffer from mental health problems. It is to say that this is an adequate avenue for them to access justice is absurd. And even the women who do manage to fill out and submit the correct forms can find themselves ignored by prison officials. And I've brought a couple examples from my clients to share with you today. So now we can go back forward. Okay, this is from a client of mine that was held in what's called administrative segregation, which is basically solitary confinement, not for any disciplinary reason, but because of a paperwork snarl that she was not processed correctly. So she has a condition called Takayasu's arteritis, and it's very dangerous. People can die from it, especially if it's not managed, as the prison didn't. And you can see she very clearly explained here what the problem was. She has these high episodes of a high blood pressure that can trigger a heart attack, a stroke, or an aneurysm. Because she's being stored in this high security unit, it takes a very long time for any kind of medical personnel to get there when she starts having one of these. So she clearly explains it, says, I need to be housed somewhere closer to medical. the response, the grievance was rejected by the prison, and the response was, "This does not affect you personally." I think we can all agree that it does. If we can go to the next. This is from a blind client of ours who is still at Fluvanna, who kept falling in her cell, and the call buttons in the cell where you can press the button and you're supposed to be heard by someone in the guards bubble area, they didn't work. They still don't work. I've been back there and I've seen that they don't work. And she's writing, "I'm tired of laying on the floor, yelling for help, beating on the wall in hopes of someone hearing me." One of the falls resulted in a fracture to her back that set off another long chain of medical failures at the prison. And you can see the response here was expired filing period. And it's not like the prison got this and said, "Well, you're outside the filing period, but thanks for letting us know about the problem, and we'll fix the call bells." Nothing happened. It was just kicked right back to her. So the grievance process is pretty self-defeating. And these are just two examples of so many that fill the file cabinets at my office. And these problems are not limited to Fluvanna. This is just sort of a snapshot of one of the ways that the carceral state is inflicting human costs on the people who are really most vulnerable, least able to pay them in any sense. And I think the bottom line is just that incarcerated people are in fact people. They're human beings, and our country's got to start treating them like human beings before we're going to make any progress on this issue. And that can start with how you think about prisoners and how aware you stay about prison issues. There's this wall of silence. There's the wall around the prison, but then there's the wall of silence that these prisoners can't break through. And my way of trying to help with that is the courts, organizers, and media can also make this more accessible to people. You can make this more accessible by talking about it with your friends, with other people. But this is an issue that has to break through these barriers of silence in order to be fixed. Thank you.
Testing. Dr. McDowell, thank you very much for hosting this and organizing this. My name is Jordy Yeager. I'm a journalist here. I grew up in Charlottesville. I'll be straight and to the point. I focus on issues around inequity and equity here in Charlottesville, most specifically. Sometimes that broadens out. But I'll give you some just very preliminary numbers just so you get a sense for what we're talking about locally. And with regards to juvenile, what's called DMC, disproportionate minority contact. And that's a very fancy jargony word for the interactions that law enforcement and criminal justice officials have with kids. And so this can be at multiple junction points throughout one's life. It can be on the street. It can be if you are arrested, it can be in court systems. It can be with probation officers. It can be in jails. And so we just actually got these numbers earlier this week. And in Charlottesville last year, 75% of the children who were arrested in Charlottesville were African American. 25% were white. And we don't have that ratio of African American and white children overall speaking in Charlottesville. About 33% of our children in the city school system are African American, and about 40 to 50% are white. So this is what's called disproportionality. This wasn't just, an anomaly. This happened year after year after year after year. So in 2016, it was actually 82% of the children arrested were African American, and about 18% were white. The year before that was an actual anomaly and had 45% African American and 54% white. But again, this is not proportionate to the overall population numbers in Charlottesville. And so this is something that the city has been looking at. It's gotten right up to the point of calling it as it is in terms of looking at what racist institutional systems actually look like, but then it stops. And it's at that point that people start scratching their heads and start talking about implicit bias and unconscious bias, these sorts of buzzwords. Some of these children, they go to prisons, they go to juvenile detention facilities, but a lot of them don't. And I'm going to spend the bulk of my time just talking about what happens when you don't go to prison, but you face another type of prison in your everyday life. And that is what we have here in Charlottesville. We have about 1 in 4 people in poverty. And so for every 4 people, 1 of them makes less than $25,000. You have the largest employer in the city, which is the University of Virginia. You have a lack of a living wage that's paid to the bulk of employees that make this university actually function. But the disparities in race don't stop at a living wage. They go every direction, right? So infant mortality, life expectancy, inpatient hospitalizations for healthcare. If you're talking education, you're talking literacy rates, graduation rates. If you're talking employment, there was a recent Federal Reserve study that was done that looked at the median wealth for Americans, and if you're white, it's about $171,000, and if you're black, it's about $17,000. And so this goes on and on and on. I mean, in every outcome of life, there is a racial disparity here in Charlottesville. And I started asking the question, why? And started looking at the correlation between life outcomes and these disparities along racial lines and neighborhoods. Because there's a study out of Harvard by an economist named Raj Chetty that found that one's environment is the #1 predictor for where you go in life and what happens. If you're born poor, you stay poor depending on your environment, or you get to a position of affluence because of your environment. And he studied 2,800 cities throughout the country. He studied Charlottesville. And on the scale of 2,800, Charlottesville ranked 2,700th. So that means that basically, if you're poor, you're pretty much guaranteed to stay poor. But if you're wealthy, you're pretty much guaranteed to stay wealthy. And so when you break that down in terms of census data and where those neighborhoods are that are below the poverty line and above the poverty line, they're pretty predictable in so much as those neighborhoods have largely demographically stayed the same. And so I started asking the question of why have neighborhoods evolved over time in the way that they did. And that goes back to the early 19th century when all of this land around us was plantations. Developers started buying those farmlands and started breaking them up and subdividing them. And on those subdivisions, they started building houses. In those houses, they attached deeds. And in those deeds, they had covenants or clauses. Some were fairly mundane, like your house shall be no closer to the road than 40 feet. It was an attempt to try to provide some uniformity to neighborhoods. But there was one specific clause that I'm finding is in about 3/4 of the housing stock that was built from 1900 to 1950. And that's the majority of single-family homes in Charlottesville at that time. And that clause, that covenant in the deeds said, no one shall own or occupy this home other than people of the Caucasian race. And what that did was 2 significant things. It permanently cemented segregation in terms of geography in the city, but more so, it also changed the trajectory, and I would argue permanently, in Charlottesville of wealth and affluence. Because those neighborhoods, they were farmlands. They needed to be on the city's grid, and so they were petitioning the city council. We didn't have a planning department. And they were petitioning, this is the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. They were petitioning for gas lines, water lines, sewer lines, electric lines. They petitioned to get their streets paved, trees planted, and those petitions were being met and granted. At the same time, African American neighborhoods were petitioning the same exact things. Lincoln Heights, Kellytown, parts of Fifeville, Vinegar Hill, and those petitions were getting explicitly denied. And we're in the process of cataloging this and tracking it to look at how much taxpayer dollars were invested into white neighborhoods, because those investments then allowed those homes to appreciate in value. And those homes could then be used as collateral. And so we're tracking first-time home buyers in 1924, for instance, north of downtown, who then took a second mortgage out on the home or sold their home and moved to a different neighborhood and used those proceeds to send Junior to college. How many six-figure salaries do you have in your family tree as a result of that first-time home purchase? And that's what we're studying. And we're starting to get some preliminary numbers in, and it's pretty astronomical. But what is key is that something Dennis said, this quote from Jamaica Kincaid about history being this open wound. And I think a lot of times in Charlottesville, we like to either nostalgize the history that we talk about, or we don't like to talk about it at all. And it's very much interwoven to what we're talking about today with housing. And looking at the need to solve a lot of these disparities on a systemic and underlying level. And yet we haven't even approached the actual reality of what these actions have done. And so, and for instance, I give you, 1960, 1963, the Housing Authority in Charlottesville is created, and they start with a process called urban renewal. You got 29 black-owned businesses in the heart of Charlottesville. They grossed about $1.6 million the year before they were raised, and they were bulldozed entirely. These are everything from your grocery stores, your restaurants, your hotels, your saloons, your haberdasheries, your tailors, your seamstresses, everything that you would want in an economy they had, and it was completely wiped out. One or two of those businesses opened in neighboring nearby, but the bulk of them shuttered. And all of those desires, all of those needs in a community still had their place. And so they started frequenting white businesses, again, cementing the wealth within Charlottesville along racial lines. And so when we're talking about the perpetuation of poverty, when we're talking about the perpetuation of quality of life and the racial disparity that exists there, I don't think that we can act as though it just miraculously occurred or was coincidental. And I think we have to actually take proactive action to counteract that. And that's what we're in the process of doing, is looking at the numbers in terms of presenting the city, presenting the university with some concrete sort of asks that would be a step towards the justification of investment in communities today. And so I just, I want to, I guess, wrap up with that, because I don't want to beleaguer it too long, but it is the case that that these neighborhoods still exist in the same fashion today, right? So if you go into any single one of them, there are very few people of color in North Downtown or Locust Grove or even Fry Springs, and that's not accidental. And it is something that if you are incarcerated as a child, as an adult, and you come home, this is what you come home to. And this is part of the reality that I think creates an overall feeling that you do not belong and that you are not worthy. And that's something that I think needs to be addressed.
All right, how y'all doing? There's only a couple of y'all. How the rest of y'all doing? That's a real question. So I guess I'll ask again, how are y'all doing? Okay, right. So, peace to y'all. I guess, I didn't intend to say this, but so I'm here to talk about the implications of this work that I try to do on the conversation that we're having here, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and then share the space with you all who are here. What I was thinking as people were talking that so when I went off to start my undergraduate study, I had a really good friend who helped me pay for school, and it was because I was a rapper that we met. He helped me join this fraternity. I mean, like, he didn't help me join the fraternity, but if you join a fraternity, you have to pay money and this stuff. And he's like, well, don't worry about that. Like, you'll need that network. I didn't ask him how he was going to get the money because I knew. The day that I was being read into the fraternity, the task force came and they knocked his door down. And so he spent most of my undergraduate, the rest of my undergraduate years in prison. And I graduated, and I went to my master's program, and he was still in prison. And then he was well, he got out while I was in my doctoral program. And we're still in contact. It's a rough transition. And I mean, you know, I wrote this, well, there's this book that I wrote. It's called Code, and it kind of talks about that process, you know, what it means to try to do work given that story, working through that story, stories like that, because it's not like an abnormal thing. And so I say that my aim is to write in hip hop. And so what I'm doing here tonight is it's another attempt. And I also say that it stands consequently as evidence of the policed body, the voice that comes from that body, resisting arrest and surveillance, making itself known as that upon which law is dependent, its performance, evaluation, and adjudication in this space, or any space like this institution, can be viewed as a pushing forward because of the tension created by its thesis and execution. And I reference Stefano Harney and Fred Moten to go underground to help articulate this point. They offer perspectives on how one might engage in university and fugitivity. They write, quote, that the subversive intellectual came under false pretenses with bad documents out of love. Her labor is as necessary as it is unwelcome. The university needs what she bears but cannot bear what she brings, end quote. They write that eventually, quote, she disappears into the underground, into the undercommons of enlightenment where the work gets done, where the work gets subverted, where the revolution is still black, still strong, end quote. So this project, this tension, these words are black study, the work of fugitive planning. It is work for and against the university, for and against disciplines, for and against verification and validation. The object of this work is the aim of this work, and the work is underground. This introduction is a bad document identifying the fugitive as a citizen. The aim of this work is the object of this work. This introduction is a bad document identifying the fugitive as a citizen. This piece is called Sticks and Stones. Now that we see the broken bodies and bones, the bruises of the battered, not from sticks and stones, but from the result of what we've long been taught could never hurt us, I wonder if we can stand by our assertion that words don't matter as much as they've always told us. So I wear all these and those words on my back, hoping to fashion out of them wings that weigh as much as the histories they hold and are held by them. That I can spread them from one end to the other of an empty, infinite scroll and beat them against that vast void, making marks and music, moving me higher and farther, lifting me upward and outward, testing me over and over, letting me know and understand that if we are simply a collection of these and those stories we tell and are told of who we were and are and can and will be, and what we never will until we wield our words against those willed to us, used against us. And though they're heavy as hell, I don't mind wearing them because these wings ain't never been a burden. And the flight is worthy of fear, but the main difference between me and Icarus, his and my wings, is the closer mine take me to sea or sun, the less I worry about drowning or burning, and the more I think about scenes of sons and daughters seeing one another set overseas of centuries, as sure of their place in the world as I am that waxing poetic about them here is a seed that can grow into them, all while they're growing into it, knowing they too are products of not only what we say, but what we do. And rather than become broken bodies and bones, rather than being bruised and battered, they'll be equipped to fight those sticks and those stones, the rhetoric of war, the worst of all the words in the world used as weapons against them, and theirs will be wings fashioned through fire, worn proudly, with not a slouched shoulder nor a complaint, and they'll meet one another with the familiar greeting passed down through years, the understood answer being nothing, because they'll all know that's the only thing that's ever been able to rise above them. Absolutely nothing. And this piece is it's called Documented. The music, I sampled Michael Brown's mother, Leslie McSpadden, also a couple of lines from Mobb Deep and Dead Prez, as well as Aretha Franklin. So, raised in the streets, no surprise where we at. J's on my feet, bullseyes on my back. Listen, the thin line between better living and prison is where I happen to get it. Can't write me out of existence. The sentences that I'm given are disproportionate. Literacy's important. Scribbling me distorted. Written to be reported. Luckily, it's recorded. History won't forget me like Emmett, Trayvon, and Jordan. And since the birth of a nation, the curse that I'm facing is hurting, helped disturb my relations to my forefathers, my mother and my sister suspect. If we all reap what we sow, know that when I collect, I'm coming for souls, the white and the blue and the red, the life and the loss, the blood, sweat, and tears that were shed, return them to me. Because if you really earn what you keep, they're all mine. They told me to pray, bend my knees and hope for a way to be free, forget man and focus on faith, and I tried. But when I opened up my eyes, I was lost, looking back, forward, and side to side, crying and caught off guard. Our Father who art in heaven, I ask, white sheep or black face, why should I wear a mask? If my choices are suicide or marching straight into slaughter, I ain't trying to play in the game, but can't save me a quarter, then what do I do? Not win or say, fuck it and lose, a kamikaze mission, literally, catch 22, flyer than fuck. In my eyes, you see what is up, but you don't really want to know, and you got reason enough to do what you will, and so will I, future fulfilled. Imagine hoping every day that you live, the way that you live, the way that you give something to stand in the fight, and I'm knowing I'm outnumbered. If it's over tonight, then remember, I said I was before I knew it was planned. I was a human being. I was a man who was raised in the streets. No surprise where we at. J's on my feet, bull's eyes on my back. Listen. The thin line between better living and prison is where I happen to get it. Can't write me out of existence. The sentences that I'm given are disproportionate. Literacy's important. Scribbling me distorted, written to be reported. Luckily, it's recorded. History won't forget me, like Emmett, Trayvon, and Jordan. This morning I woke up, I got an alert on my phone that told me. So I came here from South Carolina. I'm not from South Carolina, I'm from Illinois. But I did my doctoral degree in South Carolina at Clemson. And I think that what we see, and I think that many people have alluded to, are these traditions, and institutional memory, and connections between these different institutions, like sort of the threads that weave them together. Hopefully you'll be able to see. And I do also want to say that this piece in particular was inspired by hearing Dr. Rhonda Thomas talk through a paper that she wrote for the South Carolina Review called Slaves of the State, Convict Labor, and Clemson University Land and Legacy. It's called See the Stripes. I don't think I've ever read this before. Or at least I don't think that but whatever. The site, are you all familiar with Clemson football? Like the football program, that it exists, or something? If you pay attention to NCAA football, then, they're the past few years really good. I just want to say that's why. The site of the most exciting 25 seconds in college football was made possible by prophets from the most shameful centuries in America's history. But come to the campus of Clemson University and you'd hardly be able to tell it from looking around. Solid orange, you'll see. The grounds are perfectly manicured, alluring, and monuments to the greatness that creates such institutions stand as reminders from whence we came, and since we gain so much from what we see, we smile, proud of the great tradition of which we have the benefit of saying we are now a part. Solid orange, we are. And it's easy to buy in. It starts with the song that shakes the Southland in a sea of solid orange, tiger rags that kind of grab you and say, you are now a member of this family. You are now a Clemson Tiger. Wear your orange proudly. But it's a pretty well-known fact that tigers have stripes, and almost as well known as the reason they do, and yet Clemson University, home of the Tigers, doesn't do much acknowledging of those dark marks it knows to be so integral a part of its existence. Solid orange, they say. at this university that was once a plantation, slavery being a positive good according to Master Calhoun, whose house sits still on a plot atop a hill overlooking the football field, open 7 days a week. And we can even enter through the front door. What I cannot do, however, is depend on the tour guide to give me the whole history of the foundations of that university, because for some reason or another, it's uncomfortable for some people to talk about slave owners, supremacists, and segregationists on those terms. Or it's unknown to the individual responsible for the dissemination of that information about this place, but 20 score and many more years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent our forefathers and our foremothers and exploited them for hundreds of years, which led to our being conceived in captivity and dedicated to the proposition that history is a matter of telling the story that makes us look best. Solid orange, I think. And that forces me to confront my active participation in not only the crime, but the cover-up, the whitewashing with orange of the dark parts of a history meant to be instructional lest we repeat it. And I repeatedly walk past the Strom Thurmond Institute of Government and Public Affairs and wonder, was it there that our ancestors were whipped? Because it happened. Slavery was big business, and being black meant you made profits to keep your master in the black. And if the master went into the red, he'd see red, and you'd likely wear red stripes across your back. Fact. And if that is an uncomfortable truth for the institution, so be it. These are the stripes we bear, so see them. Slavery, sharecropping, and convict labor pave the streets and sidewalks of this high seminary of learning, and earning a degree from here tethers me to the legacy of that and John C. Calhoun, Strom Thurmond, Thomas Green, Clemson, and Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who, with his henchmen, killed black members of a militia, never to be convicted but elected to public office, governor, to have statues and buildings erected in his honor eventually. The one on that beautiful campus houses the Calhoun Honors College and the School of Education. So be it, if it's comfortable to bear those stripes, see them. Because it's not uncomfortable to reap the benefits of the labor that went into the buildings or tending the land, but very much so knowing the buildings and the land are stained with years upon years of the blood, sweat, and tears of slaves and sharecroppers and so-called criminals who were lent to the institution to do the work that needed doing. Solid orange, they say. And I say the tiger cannot survive without its stripes. We cannot ignore the troubling history that brought us to this, our glorious institution, with memorials and monuments to honorable men, and call ourselves a family. And we're damned if we think we're doing ourselves any favor coloring the history one hue. One you, one me, one he, one she, one them, won't be one us till we strive to see those stripes. A tiger cannot survive without them. The sight of the most exciting 25 seconds in college football was made possible by profits from the most shameful centuries in America's history. These are the stripes we bear. And before you decide to wear the orange tee or the painted paw, think for a minute about those stripes. Think about the backs of the slaves. Think about the strips of land and the sharecroppers tied to it after so-called emancipation. Think of the uniform of that 13-year-old boy, a slave of the state, forced to help build the first buildings at this place. Think of the dark matters that matter more than you know, the difference between willing ignorance and active participation, complicit denial and abject perpetuation. Before you think solid orange, think how ridiculous a solid orange tiger would look. Think of seeing its stripes. Think of being its stripes, and think of how terrible it is to not be seen, to not be acknowledged. Think about never being doomed to repeat an atrocious history and being better because of knowing better and doing better. Because as things are now, we are the tigers built on a legacy of slavery, sharecropping, and convict labor by slave owners, supremacists, and segregationists. But come to the campus of Clemson University, and you'd hardly be able to tell it from looking around. And it's a shame. We'd be a beautiful tiger if only we could see our stripes. Now, I forgot to mention that there was audio from 12 Years a Slave that was sampled for that piece, as well as the reference to Dr. Thomas's article. And so after that, there was it's really strange interactions that I had with the university. As I was mentioning, I got this alert this morning because people continue to misread that piece and say that it was saying things that it wasn't saying. And so this morning, I received a notification that someone else had misinterpreted that very willingly to say that I was saying something that I wasn't saying. And I think that there's plenty that I was saying that they could actually contend with. This is what I wrote, though, in the wake of that. And this is part of this new project that I'm working on. It's called To My Mother. If I die in police custody, please ask questions, because though I sometimes speak out of turn and ask why more often than some folks care to entertain, I don't see me leaving in exchange with an officer so depressed and disconcerted that it would make me take me away from you. If you're told I resisted, please ask for evidence, because you and I know they're armed with everything from pepper spray to tasers, and taking that into consideration, anything that would make me move suddenly or do anything to escalate their use of force to my own final destination in that moment is less likely than what you'll find to be true. If they tell you how bad I was before then, please remain vigilant, because none of my past behavior should justify me leaving an interaction with law enforcement with the ultimate penalty enacted without the due process afforded others in courts of law. In fact, if law enforcement forces those who laws enforced impact, whose backs and torsos act as source code hacked, and more so lack the morals tact to moral acts, then go and ask if my blasting or maiming was more a result of semi-factual blaming than poor tactical training. And whoever's tasked with staffing and claiming credit for a job well done should be person number one to whom this query is posed. What I'm asking is for you to ask and keep asking. If those sworn to protect and serve say to you that in order to properly execute their duties, it was necessary to execute me, and the truth, as you know it, doesn't match up with the truth you know to be, it's likely because the truth that's in between the two is too inconvenient for those who have the power to speak it. And the way to honor me isn't to turn the other cheek. It's to ask again and again and again, why? And I'm telling you now to ask these questions then, because it seems to be happening far too frequently, and the trend is forcing me to err on the side of suspicion. And my only true defense against what may be inevitable and conscionable as it should be to us all is to hold whoever's at fault responsible, even and especially if who's responsible is considered the law. We wield our words against those willed to us, used against us. And though they're heavy as all hell, I don't mind wearing them, because these wings ain't never been a burden and the flight is worthy of fear. But the main difference between me and Icarus, his and my wings, is the closer mine take me to sea or sun, the less I worry about drowning or burning, and the more I think about scenes of sons and daughters seeing one another set over seas of century, as sure of their place in the world as I am that waxing poetic about them here is a seed that can grow into them all while they're growing into it, knowing they too are products of not only what we say, but what we do. And rather than become broken bodies and bones, rather than remain broken bodies and bones, rather than being bruised and battered, they'll be equipped to fight those sticks and those stones, the rhetoric of war, the worst of all the words in the world used as weapons against them, and theirs will be wings fashioned through fire, worn proudly with not a slouched shoulder nor a complaint, and they'll meet one another with the familiar greeting passed down through years, the understood answer being nothing, because they'll all know that's the only thing that's ever been able to rise above them. Absolutely nothing. Peace.
Well, we've got a late start and we are inching into people's dinner hour. We almost never want to have any event that people don't want to at least have a say for 10 minutes. If those of you who wish, please, to any member of the panel. Comments, any questions, any observations, any? Yes, go ahead, my friend.
Hi, my name is Evie, and I'm second year. So my question is how, because I know in particular, like the university was January we're very much endowed in terms of funds and so how, and it was a great surprise for me to know that there's a prison, like 20 miles or so away from here. How would you suggest a student body here can get involved and, take an action and step towards making sure that these unjust treatments are being, placed on people that don't deserve?
Okay, I was going to refer to this and tell you more about student organizing.
I'm going to refer to you.
Okay, all right.
Territory.
Well, that's a great question. I would say, so there are a lot of organizations that do work to help incarcerated people, and one big thing that you can do is get involved volunteering with some of those organizations, and UVA actually makes it relatively easy to do this. So my organization has many undergrad UVA students that come, and actually one of those students goes out to Fluvanna and visits the women there and finds out what's going and comes back and reports to me, and she works directly with them. And so if you're interested in helping an organization that's already established, looking at the organizations in town that do this kind of work, and going through even UVA to work with them is a great option that is pretty easily facilitated through things like Madison House or the University Internship Program. If you're looking for something more grassroots, and I would echo Dennis and say you have a voice and you have a network, and if this is something that you feel passionately about, this may be something that you want to organize around, and you want to start educating other people in the university who clearly nobody knew that there's a prison, right? I think one person raised their hand, and this is something that you could try to educate people about more. And we actually have a lot of prisons around this area. There's the Fluvanna prison, there's the Goochland prison, there are 2 farms, work centers in Goochland, there's another in Deerfield. The prison industrial complex has a very strong footprint in this immediate area, and so this is a place where there's a lot of room for that kind of organization and that kind of education, because I don't think that most people know that. That's sort of my thoughts.
Can I just add that I think that, one of the things that I've found in working with that group, I had mentioned the student group, Students Against Mass Incarceration, SAMI, at UCSD, is that some of the most powerful work at a grassroots level has been at local high schools, doing like Prison Industrial Complex 101 with youth who are the most targeted, who can obviously give their own input onto what that 101 is in ways that are really important. I think that, a part of that has been the political education piece for the students themselves, and then taking that out in the communities who are most targeted. Many of the students come from targeted communities in other cities, so it's a kind of fact-finding thing. At the same time, it's really important for the youth in these communities that are the targeted communities to feel that there are folks in places like UVA that give a damn and understand that the narratives that we're given on shows like Cops or the millions of shows that come out that demonize people from our communities are off base at best and actually criminal at worst. So I think that's another thing. You can organize among yourselves. Some of the titles that I mentioned you haven't read, and then take that work out in communities that are affected.
And one other thing also occurred to me, which is the Charlottesville Albemarle Regional Jail is very close to here, and there has been, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there has been a lot of talk lately about their policy of handing over immigrant detainees to ICE, basically holding them and giving ICE a courtesy call to let them know that they're about to be released, so that the moment they walk out the jail door, ICE is there waiting for them and can take them into custody. That is something that is entirely within our local jail board's discretion to decide whether they do or not. They don't have to do that. They're affirmatively doing that. And this policy is up for debate right now, and there have been a number of rallies held at the jail and around Charlottesville to try to get our voices out there and tell the jail board we don't want this. This is not what we want the Charlottesville community to be doing. So that's currently happening. I think that their next vote is scheduled actually next month. So that's a current thing that if you wanted to show up and actually raise your voice with some other people, that's going on right now.
Anybody else? Any comments? Yes.
Sasha Ford and Angela Davis are talking about
Can you speak up? I can't.
Sasha Ford and Angela Davis have always talked about the importance of pressuring the bourgeois democracies internationally. So I was just wondering if you could speak at all to the connection between mass incarceration in the United States and mass incarceration in Palestine.
Palestine.
Yes.
I actually can, given that I took part in the first ever delegation, you may have seen that in the bio, from the U.S. That was official in its capacity around the arena of prisoner solidarity with former political prisoners, former members of the Black Panther Party and other organizations, and also Palestinians who are in the diaspora who've been dispossessed of their entitlement to their rightful claim to their land in Palestine. And what came out of that experience on an official level, and there's an official delegation statement that came out of that I can share later, and that you can find online very easily. What came out of that is something that I heard, especially within Jordy's and everybody's presentations tonight actually, is the way in which what they say about Palestine, what Palestinians say is really true. And that is that it's the biggest open air prison Gaza on the planet. And that reminded me, speaking of Asada, of how she talked about in her autobiography, how the prisons that she was held captive in were, again, the 0 degree of something that Black communities face in the quote unquote free world. She said inside is maximum security, outside is minimum security. And the pieces of the Brother read, just that way in which the poem to his mother, I think we can all kind of relate it. It made me think of June Jordan's On Police Violence, a poem that I hope everybody, if you haven't already, has a chance to read. Just to share, like my own father was murdered by police when I was 7 years old, shot 5 times in the back, supposedly for a $40 robbery by a police officer who received a commendation for that act. My little brother's father, when he was 7 years old, was murdered by police as well in Mississippi. And when I traveled in Palestine with former members of the Black Panther Party, what I heard was stories like those of the family of Muhammad Abdul Qadir, whose mother told a story about their 14-year-old son being abducted by those who were called settlers, the centurions of the dispossession of Palestinians in the West Bank, who illegally are occupying their land and traveling on basically Bantustan, Jewish-only roads within the West Bank, and then terrorizing communities in the process, taking all the good water and good land. They abducted her 14-year-old child and poured gasoline down his throat and burned him alive. And I was sitting there next to a former Black Panther who was from Mississippi, who remembered his mother taking him and his siblings and putting them in a house and locking the door for a time and telling them not to go outside. And that was when one of these very iconic, horrific images of a young child being similarly dealt with in Mississippi near where he lived. And I remember just seeing his face, because we talk about solidarity a lot. And these are, of course, the spectacular examples of a more grinding process. But I think it's important to say that for him, the concept of solidarity became de-abstracted, if you will, in that moment, because he felt a visceral connection to the occupation and to the colonial project there, one that he recognized in a way as his own story, not exactly the same, but that he could feel the connection in a way that went beyond just, okay, words on a page of solidarity. So I think that notion of the carceral, I think I saw something like, Adamir has statistics on this, but something like 60 to 70% of men, Palestinian men, have done time at one point or another in the occupied territories. So when we start looking at the connections in terms of the carceral state, I think that logic is a place to really look at in terms of how do we foreground or how do we foment a politics of solidarity that can really touch upon these experiences. So thank you for that question. I don't know if that really touches upon what you're doing. Thank you.
I have just an announcement, not to like this long about what Ms. said, and more as a concept of solidarity. So on Friday, Pluma's ESA and a bunch of other super organizations are sponsoring the Bill fundraiser. And the event will be a dinner and a dance party that will be held on Friday, October 19th from 6 p.m. to 1 a.m. The entrance ticket, which is like $5 for students, $10 for individuals, and $20 for families. The money from that will go towards a jail bond fund to help undocumented immigrants that are put in the local Albemarle County jail, regional jail, to be able to place bond and go home to their families so that ICE agents cannot come after them. So that was the email that I received, and so that's a public event. That's Friday night, just to, if we're talking about what's solidarity in jail. It's something that you can do when you go to support also.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.